Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on what time it is where you're listening to this podcast. My name is Jamie Dobson. I'm the founder of Container Solutions and the host of this podcast, The Cloud Native Attitude.
And I'm Ian Mile, partner at Container Solutions, where I work with Jamie to solve cloud problems with our clients.
Cloud problems with our clients, sometimes without them as well. And we are joined today by the wonderful Adrian Moat. Do you want to say hello, Adrian?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for introducing me, Jamie.
No problem. You're going to get a proper introduction in a minute. So for the readers, especially those, for the readers, I keep saying for the readers, I've been recording too many audiobooks, guys. For the listeners, we will be doing a few things today. We're going to start the podcast by talking about the broad family of use cases that I think containers can be put to, or that containers solve. Now, luckily, I'm joined by two of the industry's leading experts, Adrian Moat and, of course, my co-pilot on these matters, Ian Mile, both of whom have used containers widely successfully, both of whom have written books, talked about this, and they're going to be looking into much more interesting use cases than I could necessarily come up with. But then finally, because most of the listeners will know that Adrian is an expert, a leading expert on container security. So this is one of the most important use cases for containers. How do we scan containers? Is there a way to fix them or remediate them on the fly? I think the answer to that question, by the way, is yes. And so we'll end the podcast by looking at something that's both massively interesting from a use case perspective, but also really, really interesting to all the people that we work with, not just in finance, but in retail, and in fact, anybody who's building large-scale distributed systems. Now, with this in mind, and you two need to shout out if you think I'm wrong, my naive take on this. Now, as somebody who ran a business called Container Solutions, you think I'd be a little bit more of an expert on these matters, but I always saw containers as solving two problems. Now, the first one sort of came from a development perspective or a developer's angle, and it was to do with eliminating variability within the build environment. And so, for example, if I needed a certain library, do you remember C and C++? Surely you do, Adrian and Ian.
That's my first language, is C++.
Do you remember having to link your C libraries to create link libraries and dynamic link libraries? Well, so this was where I first came to look at containers. How do we reproduce our build so that if it's working on my machine, it's working on another machine? That used to be not that important until that thing called the web arrived, and then it was very important. And the second big sort of use case, in my opinion, is that containers can be used to pack virtual machines on the public cloud so that your bill, your end of month bill, isn't absolutely ginormous. So this is my opening gambit, and I'm going to now throw it over to you two to discuss. And specifically, I think I'd like to start with the elimination of variability within the build process, and what do you make of that? And am I stupid? As taking that as my starting point.
Okay, how do we decide who goes first?
You can go first.
Let's put your hand up.
You're the guest.
Okay, back at school. So I think that elimination, what do you call it? Elimination of variation.
Elimination,
That's a tongue twister.
elimination of variability within the build process. It's too much of a mouthful.
Okay. Well, I think that is the key point. I would put it slightly differently, though, because what that meant was we got portability. As in, I create an image, we can use it anywhere, I've run it on other people's computer. And because we got that portability, it became like an excellent sort of packaging format. So there's a great Brian Cantrell quote that I use all the time. It was something like, let's see if I can remember it offhand, and you'll go and correct me afterwards, I guess. But it was something like Docker did to apt what apt did to tarballs. And the point is, we're just kind of moving up the stack of packaging, really. So, apt's great, but you still have to, make sure everything matches up. If you have two apt packages or yum packages or whatever from different versions or whatever, they're not going to work together. So there's still problems at that level, but if you have a Docker container, it should all be designed to work together, and it's quite happily will work against Docker containers running different operating systems, and so or on a host with Docker containers from different OSs and so on.
Right. So we'll track Brian down later to verify that quote. Ian, is that kind of where you were coming from as well, or is that the type of definition?
Yeah, I think what Adrian's described is a variation of what you said, right? So tarballs help eliminate variability rather than having 100 files. You've got one file that you pass around, so there's less risk of drift. But yeah, no, as Adrian was talking, I was thinking about how I got into Docker. I don't know exactly how you got into Docker, Adrian, but we both wrote books for publishers at about the same time. So at the time I was working, this was about 2015, I was working for in third line support for a high transaction system, high speed transaction system, and we couldn't get environments to test on. We were reliant on environments that were set up by other people and were different to other environments and perhaps even different to production. And you had to ask people if you could get access to their environment to test your fix. And we tried VMs and they just hadn't worked for us. You ended up with it was a 15-year-old 3-tier stack, and you ended up with a huge 10 gig VM, and you couldn't easily pass it around. You couldn't easily download it, especially if you're in another country, and it just didn't work for us as a tool. So when Docker came along, it was great for us because I ended up building for each of our customers an environment in a box, and I could rebuild that every day. And if I had a change to it, we could use the layered file system to just send them the new files. And it was wonderful. Suddenly we had CI/CD. So in that sense, I jumped ahead of what you were saying there, Adrian. I jumped ahead to packaging the entire system. And everyone at the time told me, this is wrong, you shouldn't be using Docker for this. And I was saying, well, we're saving money by using this technology. What more could we want from a business?
Would you say you came at that from a developer angle, Ian?
Well, at the time, so I was a developer originally, then I was a developer lead, and then I ended up, for various reasons, working in third line support, getting shouted at because things were down. And because there was so much money was moving through these systems, it was quite a well remunerated job. So I thought of myself as a developer, but I was actually a maintainer. I was an SRE probably in Google terms.
So I remember, and I've talked about this frequently, just finished writing a book about this actually, but when I first built web applications, and the big ones especially, if we were testing locally, we had new version of Java, structs, do you remember structs?
Mm-hmm.
Would come in a Java file, you'd import them to your Java class, package it up, great. Now, getting that onto the continuous integration server was reasonably easy because, that was sat in the corner of our room. But then once we moved to production, you literally had to fill in a paper form and say which version of structure you needed, which version of Java you needed, etc., etc. Now, that meant that you were writing down the configuration on a piece of paper. To me, what Docker helped with was instead of putting that configuration on a piece of paper, you put it in a Docker file that would later get changed to an image. And I suppose my question to you, Adrian, this time, young people listening in, will they even know what configuration drift is? Do they understand that when you build something on one machine, you need the same set of dependencies on the other machine? Or is that now a solved problem completely?
It's a good question. I think you still hit it. We hit it all the time in certain ways. Like it's kind of the same thing. You try to update a library in your code, then everything breaks because something doesn't work with that library, and it's kind of the same problem. So updates are still a huge issue within the industry. I mean, I guess it'll never be fully solved, but I think it's similar.
Yeah, so if people are thinking it's not a real business problem, it is, because if you, for example, if the server you're running your system on automatically downloads a new version of something, boom, you blow up in production. Now, nowadays, if you've got containerized and automated workflows, you can press rebuild and get a patch sent quickly. But in the old days, without container packaging, it was actually a nightmare to track down where the failure was, and then sometimes an even bigger nightmare to patch it.
Right, and quite often, I think that's the other important point is with VMs, what we quite often did was we went into the live VM and started trying to update things and fix it there. Now what we do is blow that away and put a new thing up.
Does that mean that when we stopped treating our servers as pets and started treating them as cattle, was Docker essential for that to happen, Ian?
No, it wasn't essential because we could have done it the right way all the time, but it definitely made it easier because the single unit of packaging, as Adrian said, was now the container image. And because we've reoriented ourselves to thinking about container images as being the unit of deployment and not the server, it just makes it more natural that we think of it in that way, and we treat it in that way. So yeah, not essential, but has greatly allowed us to move into that world. And it, of course, facilitated the introduction of container, what they called orchestrators, container orchestrators like Mesos and Kubernetes, which have now become the base platform for many, if not most, businesses these days.
Is it fair to say that the tools like Kubernetes and Apache Mesos, although who's using that nowadays?
Instead,
Yeah, is it fair to say that Kubernetes simply couldn't function without the container as we know it?
Well, that's a good question because you could have done it with VMs.
and there is support for doing it with VMs. Like that is a thing now,
Yeah.
and
But
WebAssembly.
it made it much easier. Well, the adoption of Docker as the de facto container, popular format, image, whatever, meant that Google could then publicize their internal platform architecture using Kubernetes. So it's a series of happy accidents, of which Docker was one very key component.
Now, I'm going to switch to a second use case, which is related. So if I'm tuning in correctly to what you're saying, guys, we're talking about portability and packaging. That's what you're saying is the killer app, Adrian.
Yeah, I think so.
Right. So therefore, now Ian, you've got to cover your ears. This is a trigger warning. Trigger warning, everybody. Ian has just published a blog that's doing very, very well, unsurprisingly, and it's called "Why I'm No Longer Talking to People About Microservices."
I saw that.
To architects.
Yeah, to architects. And the problem is I've got architects texting me saying your mate Ian's out of order. That's true, Ian, by the way. Why is it picking on architects? It's not just us. So Ian's written a cool blog, "Why I'm no longer talking about microservices with architects." But unfortunately, actually though, Ian, it's fine. I'm not an architect.
Yeah, that's
I'm
right.
a computer programmer.
I don't think of you as anything technical.
No, exactly. Okay, fine. Now, of course, then we have to talk about microservices. What is the relationship between this standard portability and packaging mechanism and microservice architectures, Ian?
Well, I've vowed never to talk about of microservices again, but just for you, Jamie. Well, again, I think it's a similar story. So it's made it easier. It's facilitated that shift towards smaller components. So in the old days, the days that I was talking about with my 3-tier system, you'd generally have a monolithic database, and you'd think of it as a whole system. You'd think of the system as a single unit. But now we think of individual services as single units and treat them as independently updatable. That is a key part of what people are talking about when they're talking about microservices.
But that means that teams will update some microservices and not others.
Yes,
right?
Potentially.
And that implies to me black belt, high level build automation and continuous integration. Is that fair?
Yes.
How many companies have got that?
Well, I mean, we talk to those that generally haven't. So we don't talk to the ones who don't need our help. So it's hard for us to know our sample size is small. So I talk to people who are like, well, everyone is using Docker containers and everyone has CI/CD. So what's the problem? And even 10 years ago, when I started using Docker to implement CI/CD, there were people who said, everyone's using it. Why are you not using it? And there were lots of people who were saying, no, none of us are using it. So this sort of bias we get through what we see makes it hard for me to answer that question. But I don't see many people doing it in a significantly successful level.
Do you see that, Adrian?
Well, what I would say is that it's I would say the average level has moved on hugely. I mean, you
Mm.
remember the time when, like, we had source code and floppy disks and we're passing it about and struggling to, build an application because everybody had different versions of source code. It was just, like, we have moved on so much as an industry. And I think things like GitHub Actions are fairly well. Many companies as well as open source projects will rely on things like GitHub Actions, which is just codifying your CI/CD. So we are at a much better place than we used to be. It's definitely still not perfect. There's definitely things I can find to complain about, but yeah, I would say we're much more. Well, in one sense, we're more sophisticated, but honestly, CI/CD is not a. It's not a complicated concept. It's just build things continuously. And people try to make it complicated, like with all those Git flows and stuff. But at its heart, it's fairly simple.
It's the concept is very simple. This is the problem I say with cloud native is you explain it to people and they go, well, of course we want to do it like that. The discipline is
It's
the
a-
hard bit.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Just a little anecdote
Yeah.
from an old timer. So you were talking there, Adrian, about how it's moved the industry on and how things used to be. Well, I'm sure we've all got a story like this, but I remember when I first joined the company that I was working at before. This was about the year 2000. They were introducing, and there was only about 40 people in the room. They were introducing the concept of source control, and my tech lead at the time was like, "Well, I'm not using that. I know how to use tar files." And the guy who was introducing CVS, as it was then, across the teams, came round the teams and got to my tech lead, who was a bit of a scary guy, and he looked at his tar files and went, "Okay, so you're all right for now. When everyone else is using CVS, I'm going to come back to you." And of course, eventually we did move to source control, but there was even resistance to that as a discipline. So discipline is hard, especially when what you've been doing has been making you money up till now.
I
CVS had
agree.
issues as well.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I agree. So when I built my first continuous delivery system, just getting the developers to put the values of environment variables into text files so that we could rebuild stuff was a nightmare. It was a simple childlike play, but it took them out of their workflow. So if you were hacking away in Java using TDD, writing your test first in that routine, you were stepping into a different context to update the continuous integration server. Adrian was disciplined. I was disciplined. Most people are crap. Now, I don't know if I can out anecdote you, but I'd like to do two things. First of all, I just want to shout out to Nathan Harvey and the team at Dora. So, for those of you who don't know the Dora research, Adrian, I'm guessing you're aware of what the people at Dora are doing, right?
Rings a bell. Please tell me.
Oh my God, it rings a bell. Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot, Ian. What does Dora stand for?
Oh God,
Oh my God,
I always talk about Dora, but I can't actually remember what it stands for offhand.
Dora is the DevOps. What does the R stand for?
Reliability.
The state of DevOps.
Oh, this is embarrassing. We've been showing up, Jamie.
I'm actually Googling it right now. Okay.
You've lost me now.
Right. So so apart from the fact that none of us, I would just like to say we are all middle-aged men and we're all fathers, which means recalling things quickly is not something that's coming naturally to us right now. But the group at Dora, they release the State of DevOps report every year, and they study things like who's picking up continuous integration, who's an elite performer, and all of that. Now, we've talked about configuration drift in this podcast, but as Adrian said, there is a drift. We're getting better. More people become elite performers, more are moving into the average. And I know, for example, Nathan Harvey and Charity Majors will be doing a podcast, I think this week or next week, and I think it's well worth looking at. So Nathan's right in the centre of all of this. So Adrian's right. We are getting better on average every year, even though some of the laggards, through our perspective, might seem like the miles behind, but they're probably further ahead than they were 10 years ago. That was the first thing. Now, the second thing is this. Our first, obviously, this customer will remain unnamed, but we went to quite an advanced institution 2 years into Container Solutions' birth because they wanted help with containers and continuous integration. And what happened is, as part of the build process, software was stored on a what do you remember those zip disks? It went to the USB.
Zip disks, yeah.
Zip file.
Blue ones.
Yeah, it went on to that, and it was walked around the building. And I remember the route because I was thinking, God, the route's really important because of cameras and security and stuff. No, but it wasn't a specific route for a specific reason. It's just that that was where that other person's office was. And that person's job, and I didn't know this at the time, we were doing a value stream analysis. That person's job was to unpack the zip file. I was like, fucking hell. Jesus, my God, what's happening there? And it was a closed room. So I said, do you mind if I come in and interview and discuss your workflow for this value stream map? No problem, they said. So I said, now what do you do? You put the zip file in, and I thought there was maybe some thumbprint for security. Oh no, it just pops up on the Windows machine, and they mount the disk. And then I looked at the file. I said, is that a WAR file, a Java Web Archive file? He said, yeah. What I do now is I unpack it, and then I copy and paste it. And I went, right, okay. Then I went back and I spoke to the person I'd been working with. I said, I just wanted to ask about, because you're on the same network and we've got the internet now. Why do you walk with the zip file? Oh, well, that's what we used to do. And I'm guessing in the 1980s. I said, yeah, but you don't even need to unpack it manually. You could just drag and drop it and Tomcat would pick that up. Even I knew that. And I said, yeah, but that's his job. He likes doing that job. And I was like, oh, absolutely flabbergasted, because obviously as soon as you bring a human in, you bring in the chance of more error. This was only 8 years ago. So I haven't been back to that particular institution yet. And obviously we recommended more automation. That was rejected because they quite like the workflow. And obviously as a consultant, you're often like, why did you call us? Anyway, so yes. Things have changed. Well, we'd like to think things have changed since then.
We're still surprised by similar things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember using Microsoft SourceSave. Now, I know what you're going to say. Well, that's rubbish compared to GitHub. But we used to have nothing. And I brought SourceSave into a company in 2002. And then behind my back, the managers had said, he's good, that Jamie Dobson. Oh, what a great software engineer. And it was quite
This is
easy.
a Yorkshire company.
Sorry?
This company was in Yorkshire.
No, I was in Rotterdam at the time.
I know, I'm joking.
Yeah.
You did it with a Yorkshire accent.
Oh, yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, they would have been with the Dutch accent. This Jamie Dobson, hij is een heel echt goed software engineer.
Irish.
Irish, that was my Dutch accent, speaking Dutch. Oh, my God. Right. So it was very easy back then to become a legendary software engineer by doing the simplest things. When you were doing containers, Ian, as you mentioned earlier in this podcast, you were doing things differently, more sensibly, but because people are not used to that, it's very difficult for them to accept.
Yeah, although as soon as we showed it to engineers, they loved it because they were like, what you mean I don't have to spend 2 weeks setting up a new environment for myself? I can just pull this thing and I've got a working environment. It wasn't that hard to sell.
I think containers are quite intuitive to engineers. Did infrastructure engineers have the same reaction to Docker?
We didn't have infrastructure engineers where I worked, so I don't know.
Adrian, can you remember that? Did infrastructure people open their arms to Docker, or did they say, that will never work in production and at scale and all of that?
You're right, it's both. I mean, it gets tied up in, like, as you were mentioning, DevOps. Like, containers definitely get tied up in the DevOps movement. And definitely some people did not want to give up the VMs. I mean, if you understood something, you knew how to fix it, knew how to work it, then, yeah, why would you're going to need to see big advantages to move.
Yeah.
But yeah, some people saw it and loved it, and some people didn't. I think it's very similar.
Well, there were some, there were security vulnerabilities in containers from the get-go. And some people were genuinely concerned about that for a long time. But of course, they get stamped out over time and, the graph goes asymptotic. So we don't think about that so much anymore, but it was a big deal.
You've teed up things nicely there. I do remember people talking a lot about security and the security risks of containers. Now I hear people talking about containers being used to solve security issues. So you've teed this up nicely. So first of all, once you're in distributed system land, the attack vector of the system grows. And of course, once you're in container land, if you're building your images based on public source repositories, you're bringing in vulnerabilities. So Adrian, I'm now going to hand over to you to give us a summary of what are the security issues with constraints, what are the gotchas, and exactly what are you working on right now with ChainGuard?
Yeah, so I'll take it from the slightly narrower viewpoint of supply chain security, which is basically exactly what you're saying. If you're consuming like third-party code and especially open source code, people are finding vulnerabilities in that the whole time. And a lot of people use like scanners, so things like Sneak and Gripe and Trivy and so on. And they'll run that typically against a container, but you can usually run it against, other things as well. And if you take just a random image from a Docker Hub and run one of those scanners, it comes up with all these results. Now, a lot of the results are kind of nonsense. There's a lot of nonsense CVEs, right? And if you look into it, it's not something that's really going to harm you. But then, of course, you get CVEs that are important. And trying to filter out like which are important and which aren't important it's a task, and it takes a lot of time if you want to do that. And there are companies that look at these Sneak reports and try and figure out which vulnerabilities are important and which ones aren't. Now at ChainGuard, we kind of took a different viewpoint. We said, well, why are we shipping containers with vulnerabilities? Because the problem is, if you use a base image from a Docker Hub, like a Debian base image or something like that, then there's vulnerabilities in the base image, or comes up showing vulnerabilities. Again, most of them probably aren't too interesting. But you're starting from this point where you have vulnerabilities. So we took a kind of different view, and we basically create base images with zero vulnerabilities. There's a couple of ways we do that. One, we have less in the image, so we're just less software to have a vulnerability. Unlike some other images, we're not putting in like lots of utilities and network tools, etc. But the other thing is, and frankly the biggest thing, is we really aggressively keep things up to date. So we're trying to keep all our images running on the latest version of the library and components in it. And generally, like you will find that the latest version has been patched to address whatever TV is coming. Now you do get into like transitive dependencies, so sometimes we'll have to like check out a project to build it, and we'll find we've got a bump like the Go mod or whatever to address the vulnerability, and we'll take care of that.
So, Adrian, I want to ask you now, you've been with ChainGuard for a couple of years, but you've been talking about 3 years. Okay, thanks for fact checking me live on air. So you've been with ChainGuard a few years, but to be fair, you have been talking about container security for probably as long as we've been doing this. Did you used to feel like a bit of a Cassandra, that you saw the future and you had a powerful message, but nobody was listening?
That's not what happened. I wrote the book, and O'Reilly pulled out the security chapter, and everybody started asking me about it. I was asked to give talks on security, and I felt a bit of an imposter because I don't have a security background. I just wrote that chapter, and suddenly I was giving all these talks on container security, and I backed away from it a bit. But then I kind of realized that nobody was actually saying anything different to me, so I figured my advice was okay. But yeah, that's how it came about.
Well, so just for the younger listeners, Adrian, I'm just going to point out that you felt like a bit of an imposter, despite the fact that you've been working in and around computers for decades, and you are one of the world's leading experts on container security. Surely, if you have those feelings of being an imposter, then what hope does anybody less experienced than you have?
Well, I think everybody, and sometimes it's healthy. In this case, I probably could have done more to like lean into it and figure out what other security people were actually saying and doing, and that probably would have helped. But
do you think there was an element that you became a bit of an expert on container security because it was so new and you were simply ahead of everybody else, even though maybe not by that much?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So I would have never thought of myself as an expert in software development methods at least 10 years ago, 10 years ago. Who am I trying to kid? 10 years ago. But I think now I probably would say I am, because all of those agile methods, we were quite early in adopting them. And then container solutions grew out of that. How do we extend that to programmable infrastructure as well?
This is another variant of what I was talking about earlier. You imagine that there's these other people with clipboards and white coats doing amazing things that you can't understand, and you turn around and go, oh, it's me. They're looking at me for advice on this. Why me? There must be someone else better than me for this. And I think that's what happens when you're a practitioner. I remember early days talking about our Docker book, the one I wrote with Aidan Hobson Sayers. We were sort of saying what we were doing, and we were saying we don't really know what we're doing, but we're doing this and we're doing this and we're doing this experiment here. And the editor was going, this is gold. You guys need to write this down now, because no one else, very few other people are doing this. and those are not thinking about writing it down. So yeah, lean into it.
If you go back to last week's episode on the electric maze, if you step through the maze a few times, so you'll have to listen in, Adrian, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you will become an expert in that specific maze configuration. So if you take a few steps for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, you might not feel like you've become an expert, but 2 years is a hell of a long time to be looking at one specific thing, which I know for fucking sure, Adrian, you did do back then. Because I was encouraging you, because we needed the marketing material. Right, okay, so before we start to wrap up the podcast, Adrian, while we've got your attention and while we're talking about container security, what do our customers now need to look out for? What do our listeners need to sort of watch out for when it comes to container security?
I could tee up the fact that, well, when does this come out?
This is coming out next Friday, before KubeCon. You can plug KubeCon if you like.
Well, I'm actually going to plug our own conference called Assemble.
You can plug are we getting a free ticket?
You can have a free ticket, yeah.
Yes.
You've got a flight to San Francisco.
Oh, fucking hell. Oh, God. Okay, fine. No, I'll pass. Right, okay, sorry. Back to your conference.
Well, anyway, I think there should be a few new things coming out then. But supply chain security is just getting big and bigger and bigger. So, like, try and sort of trust where you're getting your software from. And like, regardless of how it's packaged, moving beyond container images and so on. I think that's a big thing that we're looking at, and how, what other people should probably be thinking about.
Fair enough. And do you have a favourite book or blog posts or resources that you could recommend to some of our younger listeners who are just getting into technology and cloud native development?
On supply chain security, I don't have any. I don't really. I might come up with some afterwards, and we can put them in the show notes. I don't have any immediate ones. Obviously, there's a ChainGuard blog.
You made a terrible assumption there that we produce show notes. We literally don't know what we're doing.
Well, I'm sure there's comments.
What you can do is you can post it on LinkedIn. Okay, we are now going to start to wrap up this podcast. I'm going to do the thing that I tried to do the other week, but Ian, you interrupted me, and then we both ended up talking for.
You told me there was a story about Patty Smith coming.
Oh, the story about Patty Smith. Okay. Oh, you've triggered a memory. So, Ian, do you know where Adrian and I know each other from?
No, I don't.
Really?
No.
So we both went to university together in 2002. And we studied high performance computing, didn't we, in the physics department at Edinburgh. For whatever reason, I fell. Don't laugh. Try not to laugh. It is a funny story, this. I fell into the depths of a deep depression. I was not a particularly happy person. And Adrian decided he was going to cheer me up. So he came around with 2 albums that he burned. Do you remember when we used to burn CDs and share them with each other? So Adrian brought round Return of the Grievous Angel by Graham Parsons and Patti Smith's Horses. And I cherish those albums. I still listen to them both regularly. And even though it cheered me up momentarily, I needed to do a little bit more work to climb out of the deep hole I was in. But I just think it's a great story of this is how boys do their very best to sort of support each other emotionally. And that actually kicked off a friendship that's still going. I was a groomsman at your wedding, wasn't I, Adrian? And you made me wear a kilt.
Yeah, that was great.
And Adrian was a groomsman at my wedding, and I didn't need to make him wear a kilt because he just wore it anyway.
Well, that's true.
Yeah. And so this is a friendship that goes back a very, very long time. And you know what? It's really funny. This is a bit sad, actually. It's 23 years, right, Adrian?
What, since we met? Yeah, something like that.
And you haven't won a single argument. I mean, what's the odds of that? You think that I'd have gotten one thing wrong, but here we are.
I'm just being nice, because I think the other album was that Neil Young's On the Beach.
He's right. Yes, I've remembered that wrong, but you did give me Patti Smith's Horses.
I did the thing, probably, yeah.
Yeah, you're right. He gave the 2 most depressing albums in the history of depressing albums to a man who was depressed. It was Neil Young's On the Beach, and I still listen to that almost every week at least. Well, that's friendship for you. Okay, so to wrap up this podcast, we've spoken briefly about imposter syndrome. That wasn't the point of the podcast, but I think that is something that younger listeners should bear in mind. We all feel like imposters, including every single person that's spoken today. We talked about, well, I say I spoke about the need to eliminate variability from the build process, but Ian and Adrian went on to explain what that means in more details. We got a bit of an introduction into supply chain management, Adrian. That's not the right
Security,
that's not
supply
right.
chain security.
Yeah, container supply chain. I fluffed it again. Say it again.
Supply chain security.
Supply chain security. And Ian almost ruined next week's surprise by talking about Kubernetes and Apache Mesos. But Ian, you've teed things up perfectly. And why is that?
Because that's next.
That is next. So for those of you who've been paying attention, we are working our way through the chapters of the book, The Cloud Native Attitude. We've done the introductory chapters. Last week we did context. This week we've done containers. And next week we're going to be talking about what happens when we dynamically orchestrate them with Kubernetes and Apache Mesos, which nobody knows what I'm talking about when I mention that. So it's probably going to be more Kubernetes than anything else. Ian, thanks for coming.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Adrian, thank you so much for dropping in. Don't forget to share those links.
Okay, thanks for having me.
He's been Adrian Moore. He's been Ian Mile. I've been Jamie Dobson. Until next time, see you then.
Bye.